I never thought my retired life in Scottsdale, Arizona would involve watching my elderly neighbors get dragged through legal hell over a paint color. But that's exactly what happened when the Oakmont Hills HOA decided to make an example out of Frank and Dorothy Henderson. My name is Gregory Norton, and I've lived in this upscale neighborhood for about 8 years now. I'm 52, divorced, work from home as a software consultant, and generally keep to myself. The Hendersons lived 2 houses down from me in a beautiful Spanish-style home they'd owned for nearly 30 years. Frank was 78, Dorothy 75, and they were the kind of neighbors everyone should have. They kept their lawn immaculate, waved hello every morning, and Frank still had the energy to help anyone who needed a hand with yard work despite his age. The trouble started on a scorching Tuesday in July when I was getting my mail and noticed a sleek black BMW pull up to the Henderson house. Out stepped Patricia Whitmore, the HOA president, with her perfectly highlighted blonde hair and designer sunglasses that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. Patricia was 47, recently divorced from a plastic surgeon, and had made it her life's mission to enforce every single HOA rule with the enthusiasm of a small-town dictator. I watched from my driveway as she marched up to the Hendersons' front door with a clipboard. Dorothy answered, wiping her hands on her apron, and I could see her friendly smile even from where I stood. That smile faded quickly. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm here to inform you that your home is in violation of Section 4.7 of the HOA covenant," Patricia announced loudly enough that I could hear every word. "Your exterior paint color is not on the approved list." Dorothy looked confused. "But we haven't painted recently. This is the same color it's been for 20 years. "That's precisely the problem," Patricia replied, tapping her expensive pen against the clipboard. "The approved color palette was updated 6 months ago, and your home no longer complies. You have 30 days to repaint to an approved color, or you'll face daily fines of $100. I saw Dorothy's face go pale. Frank appeared behind her, his weathered hand on her shoulder. "Now hold on just a minute," he said, his voice still strong despite his age. "We're on a fixed income. We can't afford to paint the entire house." Patricia's smile was cold. "Then I suggest you apply for a loan. The rules apply to everyone, Mr. Henderson. No exceptions." After she drove away, I walked over to check on them. Dorothy was crying softly in the kitchen while Frank sat at their table, looking at a stack of medical bills. That's when I learned that Dorothy had been battling breast cancer for the past year, and their savings had been decimated by treatments that insurance didn't fully cover. "The house is a terracotta color," Frank explained to me, his hands shaking slightly. "It's always been this color. It matches the Spanish tile roof perfectly. When we bought this place in 1996, this was one of the most popular colors in the neighborhood." I looked at the letter Patricia had left. The paint color was classified as Desert Sunset, which apparently was too orange and not enough beige according to the new standards. The approved colors were all variations of boring tan and gray. "Can you request a variance?" I asked. Frank nodded slowly. "The letter says we can appeal to the Architectural Review Board. Patricia chairs that board." Over the next week, I watched the situation unfold like a slow-motion car crash. Frank submitted a formal appeal, explaining their financial situation and requesting either a variance or an extended timeline. The Architectural Review Board, which consisted of Patricia and 2 of her friends, denied it within 48 hours. Their reasoning was that allowing one exception would create a precedent that would undermine the entire HOA structure. The daily fines started on day 31, $100 per day. I watched Frank's face grow more drawn and worried as August turned into September. He'd gotten quotes from painting contractors, and the cheapest estimate was $18,000 for the whole house. They didn't have $18,000. They barely had enough to cover their mortgage and Dorothy's medication. I tried to help. I organized a neighborhood meeting at my house, inviting everyone on our street to discuss the situation. About 15 people showed up, most of them sympathetic to the Hendersons. "This is ridiculous," said Maria Chen, a schoolteacher who lived across from me. "They're going to bankrupt an elderly couple over paint?" "The rules exist for a reason," countered Robert Shields, a retired accountant who served as HOA treasurer. "If we let people ignore them, property values will plummet." "Property values?" I couldn't keep the anger from my voice. We're talking about forcing people from their home over a color that's been there for decades. The meeting dissolved into arguments, but we did manage to draft a petition asking the HOA to reconsider. 23 households signed it. Patricia's response came in the form of a mass email reminding everyone that interfering with HOA enforcement actions could result in fines for those households as well. By October, the Hendersons owed over $7,000 in fines. They'd stopped answering their door, and I could see the stress written on both their faces whenever they ventured outside. Dorothy had lost more weight, and Frank moved like a man carrying the weight of the world. Then, the lawyers got involved. The HOA hired a law firm to file a lien against the Henderson property for unpaid fines. I knew this because Frank came to my door one evening, holding a legal document with trembling hands. "Greg, I don't understand half of what this says," he admitted, looking more vulnerable than I'd ever seen him. "It's talking about foreclosure." I read through the document, my stomach sinking. The HOA was indeed placing a lien on their home and threatening foreclosure proceedings if the fines weren't paid within 90 days. The total amount was now over $9,000 and climbing. "You need a lawyer," I told him. "Not tomorrow, not next week. Now." "We can't afford a lawyer," Dorothy said from behind him, her voice barely a whisper. "We've been trying to figure out if we should just sell the house and move." The thought of them being driven from their home made me furious. I spent that night researching Arizona HOA law, reading through statutes and case precedents until my eyes burned. What I found gave me a glimmer of hope. Arizona had specific protections for homeowners, including requirements that HOAs act reasonably and in good faith. There were also provisions about selective enforcement and the requirement that rules be applied consistently. The next morning, I drove through the neighborhood with my phone, taking pictures. What I discovered was infuriating but not surprising. At least 11 other homes had exterior paint colors that weren't on the new approved list. Most were in neutral tones that were close enough to approved colors that they blended in, but they were technically in violation. None of these homes had received violation notices. None of them were being fined. I printed out the photos and drove to Frank's house. "This is selective enforcement," I explained, spreading the pictures on their kitchen table. "Patricia is targeting you specifically. This gives you legal grounds to fight back." Frank looked at the photos, then at Dorothy. Something shifted in his expression, a spark of the fighter he must have been in his younger days. "How do we fight?" "We find a lawyer who specializes in HOA disputes," I said, "and I think I know someone who might help. My ex-wife's brother, Thomas Bradley, was a real estate attorney in Phoenix. We'd stayed friendly after the divorce, and when I called him that afternoon, he listened to the whole story without interrupting. "This is egregious," he said when I finished. "If you're right about the selective enforcement, they've violated their own covenant obligations. But Greg, I have to be honest with you. Fighting an HOA is expensive, and it sounds like your neighbors don't have resources." "What if they had a lawyer willing to work on contingency?" I asked. "If the HOA has been acting in bad faith, couldn't there be damages?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. "There could be. Arizona allows for recovery of legal fees in HOA disputes if the homeowner prevails, and if we can prove deliberate harassment or selective enforcement, there might be grounds for additional damages. Let me talk to my partners." 3 days later, Thomas called back. His firm was willing to take the case on a contingency basis, betting that they could not only defeat the foreclosure, but recover their fees from the HOA. Frank and Dorothy met with Thomas that week, and I went with them for moral support. Thomas's office was in a modern building in downtown Phoenix, all glass and steel. He greeted us warmly, dressed in a crisp suit, but with an approachable demeanor that immediately put the Hendersons at ease. "Let me be clear about what we're facing," Thomas began, sitting across from them in his conference room. "The HOA has legal authority to enforce covenants, but that authority isn't unlimited. They have to act reasonably, consistently, and in good faith. From what Greg has shown me, they've failed on all 3 counts." "What happens now?" Dorothy asked, her hand clutching Frank's. "Now we file an answer to their lien and foreclosure action. We'll argue that the enforcement was selective, unreasonable, and done in bad faith. We'll also file a counterclaim for harassment, emotional distress, and attorney's fees. We're going to make this expensive enough that they'll wish they'd never started this fight. The legal battle that followed was brutal. Patricia and the HOA board responded to the counterclaim with outrage, sending a letter to all homeowners claiming that the Hendersons were trying to destroy the community. Several neighbors stopped talking to me for supporting them. Someone left a nasty note on my windshield calling me a traitor to property values. But others rallied to the cause. Maria organized a fundraiser to help with any costs the Hendersons might incur. A local news station picked up the story after Thomas tipped them off, and suddenly, Patricia found herself on camera trying to justify why an elderly cancer patient was being threatened with foreclosure over paint color. "We have rules for a reason," Patricia said stiffly into the camera, her makeup perfect but her smile forced. "We can't make exceptions just because someone has a sad story. Everyone in Oakmont Hills agreed to abide by these covenants." The reporter, a sharp woman named Jennifer Wu, pressed harder. "But Mrs. Whitmore, we've verified that at least 11 other homes in the community have paint colors not on your approved list. Why aren't those homeowners being fined?" Patricia's face went red. "Those colors are close enough to approved standards. The Henderson home is significantly different." Jennifer produced photos, including several I'd provided. "This home appears to be nearly the same shade as the Henderson property. Can you explain why they weren't cited?" The interview ended shortly after, with Patricia storming off. The story aired that evening and went viral on local social media. Suddenly, the Hendersons weren't alone. Community members from other HOAs shared their own horror stories. A state representative even called for hearings on HOA abuse. Discovery in the lawsuit revealed even more damaging information. Thomas subpoenaed all HOA records related to the paint policy change and enforcement actions. What he found was shocking. The approved color palette had been changed specifically to target the Henderson home. Email records showed Patricia discussing with another board member how they could use the paint rule to force undesirable residents out of the community. The context became clearer through additional emails. Patricia had wanted to buy the Henderson property for her daughter, who was recently divorced and looking for a home in Scottsdale. The Hendersons had declined previous offers to sell. The paint violation was manufactured as pressure to force a sale at a reduced price due to the property being encumbered by HOA fines. "This is fraud," Thomas told me over the phone after reviewing the documents. "This isn't just selective enforcement. This is a deliberate scheme to defraud your neighbors of their property. We're going to destroy them in court." The preliminary hearing was scheduled for early December at the Maricopa County Superior Court. I took the day off to attend, along with at least 30 other neighbors who wanted to support the Hendersons. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with fluorescent lights and worn wooden benches that had seen decades of use. Judge Harold Martinez presided, a stern-looking man in his 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Patricia sat at the plaintiff's table with the HOA's lawyer, a slick-looking guy named David Kensington, who probably charged $500 an hour. Thomas sat with Frank and Dorothy, who looked terrified but determined. The hearing began with Kensington presenting the HOA's case. "Your Honor, this is a straightforward matter of covenant enforcement. The defendants agreed to abide by HOA rules when they purchased their property. They have willfully violated those rules and refused to remedy the violation. The HOA has followed proper procedures in assessing fines and filing a lien. We're simply asking the court to enforce a valid contract." Judge Martinez listened without expression, making occasional notes. Then it was Thomas's turn. "Your Honor, this case is about as far from straightforward as possible. What we have here is a deliberate conspiracy to defraud elderly homeowners of their property through manufactured violations and selective enforcement. The evidence will show that the HOA president personally orchestrated this scheme for her own financial benefit." The judge's eyebrow rose. "That's a serious allegation, Counselor." "I have the emails to prove it, Your Honor. I'd like to enter into evidence exhibits A through M, which include communications between HOA board members discussing how to force the Hendersons to sell their home." The next 2 hours were devastating for Patricia and the HOA. Thomas systematically presented email after email showing the conspiracy. He showed photos of the 11 other homes with non-compliant paint colors, He presented testimony from a professional home inspector who stated that the Henderson home's paint color was consistent with the neighborhood's Spanish colonial architecture and actually enhanced property values rather than diminishing them. Patricia's face grew redder and redder as the evidence mounted. Kensington tried to object repeatedly, but Judge Martinez overruled him each time, clearly interested in seeing where this was going. The turning point came when Thomas called Patricia to the stand for questioning. She'd been required to appear since the HOA was the plaintiff, and now she squirmed in the witness chair as Thomas approached with a stack of papers. "Mrs. Whitmore, you're the president of the Oakmont Hills HOA board, correct?" "Yes." Her voice was clipped, defensive. "And you chaired the architectural review committee that denied the Hendersons' variance request?" "That's correct." "Can you tell the court why you denied that request?" Patricia straightened her shoulders. "Because granting variances undermines the covenant structure. We have to be consistent in enforcement." Thomas nodded slowly, then pulled out a document. "I'd like to show you Exhibit N. This is a variance request from August 2024, just 2 months before the Henderson situation. A homeowner requested permission to install a mailbox that wasn't on the approved list. You granted that variance. Can you explain why a mailbox gets a variance but an elderly couple facing financial hardship doesn't?" Patricia's mouth opened and closed. That was different. The mailbox was a minor issue. Different how? The covenant is the covenant, isn't it? You just said you have to be consistent. Thomas didn't give her time to answer. "Let me show you Exhibit O. This is another variance granted in September 2024 for a front door color, and Exhibit P, a variance for decorative shutters. You've granted 12 variances in the past year alone, but you refused to grant one for the Hendersons. Why?" "Those were all approved because they enhanced the community," Patricia said, her voice rising. "The Henderson house looks out of place." "Out of place?" Thomas projected a photo on the courtroom screen showing the Henderson home with its terracotta paint and Spanish tile roof, nestled perfectly among similar-styled homes. "This home has looked this way for 20 years. What changed?" Patricia didn't answer, and Thomas continued. "What changed, Mrs. Whitmore, is that you decided you wanted that property for your daughter. Isn't that correct?" "That's not true." "Then explain this email." Thomas projected another document on the screen. It was from Patricia to another board member, dated June of that year. I'm reading directly. "If we can pressure the Hendersons with enough fines, they'll have to sell at a loss. Jennifer could get the house for under market value. Jennifer is your daughter, correct?" The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Martinez banged his gavel, but his expression had gone from stern to furious. Patricia's face was now completely white. "I want to see all parties in my chambers," Judge Martinez said. "Now?" What happened in chambers was related to me later by Thomas. Judge Martinez had apparently spent 15 minutes reading through the emails Thomas provided, his anger building with each page. He told both attorneys that he'd seen a lot of HOA disputes in his years on the bench, but this was one of the most clear-cut cases of fraud and abuse he'd encountered. When everyone returned to the courtroom, Judge Martinez didn't waste time. "I'm going to make this very simple. The HOA's foreclosure action is denied with prejudice. The lien is to be removed from the Henderson property immediately. Furthermore, I'm ordering the HOA to reimburse the Hendersons for all fines collected, plus interest at the statutory rate." Patricia gasped audibly. Kensington stood. "Your Honor, with respect, the HOA board was acting in what they believed to be the community's best interest." "Sit down, Counselor," Judge Martinez said sharply. "The evidence shows deliberate fraud and selective enforcement for personal gain. I'm also awarding the Hendersons their attorneys' fees and costs to be paid by the HOA. Additionally, I'm ordering that Mrs. Whitmore be removed from the HOA board immediately and barred from holding any position of authority in the Homeowners Association for a period of not less than 5 years." He wasn't finished. "I'm referring this matter to the Arizona Attorney General's office for investigation into potential criminal fraud. I'm also ordering the HOA to undergo a full audit of all enforcement actions taken in the past 3 years, conducted by an independent third party at the HOA's expense. Any other homeowners found to have been targeted through selective enforcement are to be reimbursed immediately." The courtroom erupted again, this time in cheers from the neighbors who'd attended. Dorothy was crying, but for the first time in months they were tears of relief. Frank hugged her tightly, his own eyes wet. Patricia stood abruptly and rushed from the courtroom, her face a mask of humiliation and rage. Kensington gathered his papers quickly, clearly wanting to distance himself from the disaster. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd of supporters gathered around the Hendersons. Local news crews captured footage of Dorothy hugging neighbors while Frank shook Thomas's hand repeatedly, thanking him over and over. "You don't have to thank me," Thomas said with a genuine smile. "This is why I became a lawyer, to stop bullies like Patricia Whitmore." The aftermath was swift and comprehensive. The Attorney General's investigation led to criminal charges against Patricia for attempted fraud and conspiracy to commit theft by extortion. She eventually pleaded guilty to reduced charges and was sentenced to 3 years of probation, 200 hours of community service, and ordered to pay restitution to the Hendersons for emotional distress. The HOA audit uncovered 4 other instances of selective enforcement, though none as egregious as the Henderson case. Those homeowners received refunds of all fines plus damages. The total cost to the HOA exceeded $200,000, which had to be covered by a special assessment on all homeowners, minus the Hendersons who were exempted by court order. The HOA board was completely replaced in a special election. The new board immediately revised the covenant enforcement procedures, implementing an appeals process that included neutral third-party review and requirements for photographic evidence of actual harm to property values before fines could be assessed. But the most satisfying change was personal. On a mild Saturday morning in February, I watched as Frank and Dorothy stood in their driveway, arms around each other, looking at their home. The terracotta paint gleamed in the desert sun, officially protected now by a permanent variance that had been one of the new board's first actions. "Thank you for everything, Greg," Frank said when I walked over to join them. His color was better now. The stress lines around his eyes had faded, and Dorothy looked healthier too, her cancer in remission and her spirit restored. "I just took some pictures," I said, but Frank shook his head. "You stood up when it mattered. A lot of people knew what was happening was wrong, but they were too scared to get involved. You weren't." Dorothy hugged me, and I'll admit I got a little choked up. "How are you both doing? Really?" "We're good," Dorothy said with a genuine smile. "Better than good. The reimbursement from the HOA covered all our outstanding medical bills. We're actually going to take a trip to visit our grandkids in Colorado next month. First vacation in 2 years. "That's wonderful," I said, and I meant it. Over the next few weeks, life in Oakmont Hills slowly returned to normal, though it was a different kind of normal. The neighborhood felt more like an actual community now. People talked to each other more, looked out for one another. The fear that had kept everyone silent about HOA overreach had been broken. Maria Chen organized a neighborhood barbecue in March, the first community event in years that wasn't HOA mandated. Nearly every house on our street attended, gathering in the community park with grills and lawn chairs. Kids played soccer, while adults talked and laughed, and for the first time since I'd moved here, it felt like a real neighborhood instead of a collection of houses afraid of violating arbitrary rules. I was manning a grill, flipping burgers, when Jennifer Wu from the news station approached me. She'd been invited by one of the neighbors and wanted to do a follow-up story on how the community had changed. "This is remarkable," she said, her camera operator filming the scene. 6 months ago, this neighborhood was tearing itself apart. Now look at it. People just needed permission to be human again, I told her. The HOA had created an environment of fear and suspicion. Once that broke, everyone remembered why they wanted to live in a community in the first place. The follow-up story aired the following week, featuring interviews with multiple residents about the transformation. Thomas's law firm got dozens of calls from other homeowners facing similar HOA disputes. He told me later that the Henderson case had become something of a landmark, cited in legal briefs across Arizona and even in other states, but there were still loose ends to tie up. In April, I received a letter from David Kensington, the HOA's former attorney. He'd been fired by the HOA after the judgment and was now facing a bar complaint for his role in enabling Patricia's scheme. The letter was an apology, explaining that he'd been misled by his client, but acknowledging that he should have looked more carefully at the evidence before filing the foreclosure action. I didn't respond. Some apologies come too late to matter. Patricia herself became something of a pariah in Scottsdale social circles. Her name appeared in several news articles about HOA abuse, and word spread quickly through the interconnected world of upscale Arizona communities. She ended up selling her own home in Oakmont Hills and moving to Tucson, unable to face the daily reminder of her downfall. The new HOA board, led by President Marcus Thornton, a retired engineer who'd lived in the community for 15 years, took a completely different approach to governance. One of their first actions was to rescind the updated paint color palette, restoring the original, much broader selection of acceptable colors. They also implemented a hardship policy that allowed homeowners facing financial difficulties to request extended timelines for any required improvements. The goal of an HOA should be to enhance the community, not to destroy it, Marcus said at a board meeting I attended in May. We lost sight of that, and we almost ruined innocent people's lives. That won't happen again on my watch. The meeting had actual discussion and debate, with homeowners given the opportunity to voice concerns without fear of retaliation. It was a radical change from Patricia's reign, where meetings had been rubber stamp affairs where dissent was crushed. I found myself volunteering for the Architectural Review Committee, along with 4 other neighbors who wanted to ensure that enforcement was fair and reasonable. We developed clear guidelines for what constituted actual violations versus aesthetic preferences, and we created a mediation process for disputed cases. One of our first cases involved a homeowner who'd installed solar panels without pre-approval. Under Patricia's regime, this would have triggered immediate fines. Instead, we worked with the homeowner to understand why they'd installed the panels, verified that they met safety codes, and looked at whether they negatively impacted neighbors. The panels were barely visible from the street, and the homeowner was able to provide documentation that they significantly reduced energy costs. We issued a retroactive approval and updated the guidelines to create a streamlined process for future solar installations. "This is how it should work," Frank said at one of our committee meetings. He'd been invited as an observer, and the new board frequently sought his input on policy changes. Common sense and compassion instead of blind rule enforcement. Dorothy had started a support group for homeowners dealing with difficult HOAs, meeting monthly at the community center. She shared their story and connected people with resources, including Thomas's firm. The group grew quickly, with members from HOAs across the Phoenix metropolitan area attending to share experiences and strategies. "I never want anyone to go through what we went through," Dorothy told a reporter who covered one of the meetings. "HOAs serve an important function, but they need oversight and accountability. Homeowners have rights, and they shouldn't be afraid to assert them." The story continued to ripple outward. The Arizona legislature held hearings on HOA reform in June, with both Frank and Dorothy testifying about their experience. Several bills were introduced to strengthen homeowner protections, including requirements for mediation before foreclosure actions, limits on fine amounts, and mandatory training for HOA board members on their legal obligations. I attended the hearing, sitting in the gallery as Dorothy spoke to the assembled legislators. Her voice was steady and strong, a far cry from the frightened, defeated woman I'd seen in her kitchen 9 months earlier. "Bah, we almost lost everything," she said. "Our home, our savings, our health, all because one person decided to abuse her power for personal gain. The system allowed that abuse to happen. The system needs to change." The legislators listened, and several expressed outrage at what the Hendersons had endured. Whether that outrage would translate into actual legislative change remained to be seen, but at least the conversation was happening. Summer arrived with its brutal Arizona heat, temperatures regularly topping 110 degrees. But the atmosphere in Oakmont Hills remained warm in a different way. The community had been through a crucible and emerged stronger, more united. Frank and Dorothy's home became something of a symbol. People driving through the neighborhood would sometimes stop to take pictures of the terracotta house that had sparked such controversy. A few architecture students from Arizona State University even did a project on the Spanish colonial style of the home and how it represented the cultural heritage of the region. "Who knew our house would become famous?" Frank joked one evening as we sat on his back patio, drinking iced tea and watching the sunset, paint the sky in shades that matched his home's exterior. "You earned it," I said. "You stood your ground when a lot of people would have just given up." Frank shook his head. "We had help. We had you and Thomas and all the neighbors who supported us. Nobody fights these battles alone." He was right, of course. The Henderson case hadn't been won by any single person, but by a community that finally decided enough was enough. As summer stretched into fall, life continued its normal rhythms. I worked my consulting contracts, helped with the architectural review committee, and enjoyed the quiet satisfaction of living in a neighborhood that had learned important lessons about power, accountability, and basic human decency. Dorothy's cancer remained in remission, and she'd regained the weight she'd lost during the stress of the foreclosure threat. Frank started teaching a woodworking class at the community center, sharing skills he'd developed over a lifetime. They took their trip to Colorado and came back with hundreds of photos of grandchildren and mountain vistas. The financial settlement from the HOA had been more than just medical bill reimbursement. The emotional distress damages, combined with recovered fines and interest, had given them a cushion they hadn't had in years. They could breathe easily for the first time since Dorothy's diagnosis. In October, Thomas called to tell me that Patricia's criminal case had concluded. In addition to probation and community service, she'd been required to pay a $15,000 fine to the state and additional restitution to the Hendersons. Her daughter Jennifer, who'd been aware of the scheme, faced civil liability as well, and ended up settling with the Hendersons for an undisclosed amount that Thomas said was substantial. "Justice served," Thomas said with satisfaction. "Not just legal justice, but actual justice." The HOA's insurance company had tried to deny coverage for the judgment, claiming that intentional fraud wasn't covered under the policy. That led to a separate lawsuit that was still pending, but the new board had secured emergency financing to cover the costs and ensure the Hendersons were made whole immediately. November brought cooler weather and a sense of gratitude as Thanksgiving approached. Maria organized a community potluck, and this time nearly 50 households participated. Long tables were set up in the community park, covered with dishes representing a dozen different cultural traditions. The Hendersons brought Dorothy's famous pumpkin pie, and people lined up for slices. I stood back at one point watching the scene and felt something I hadn't felt in years: genuine contentment. This was what community was supposed to be, not fear and rules and petty enforcement, but people coming together, supporting each other, celebrating their shared humanity. Frank caught my eye from across the park and raised his glass of apple cider in a silent toast. I raised mine back, and we both smiled. The legal reforms that had been proposed in the legislature passed in modified form in December, signed into law by the governor with Dorothy and Frank present at the signing ceremony. The new laws wouldn't prevent all HOA abuse, but they created better mechanisms for accountability and gave homeowners more tools to fight back against overreach. "This is your legacy," I told the Hendersons as we watched the ceremony on the local news that evening. "You changed the system." "We just wanted to keep our house," Dorothy said softly. "Everything else was because good people decided to help." Christmas came with lights and decorations throughout the neighborhood. The new HOA board had relaxed the strict decoration rules, allowing homeowners more freedom to express their holiday spirit. The result was a neighborhood that actually looked festive and welcoming rather than sterile and uniform. I spent Christmas Eve at the Henderson house, along with a dozen other neighbors who'd become genuine friends through the ordeal. We ate too much, laughed at bad jokes, and marveled at how much had changed in just a year. "Last Christmas we thought we'd be homeless by now," Frank said quietly as we stood on his front porch, looking at the lights strung along his roof. "We were preparing to tell our kids they'd have to take us in because we'd lost everything." "That didn't happen," I said. "You fought and you won." "We survived," Frank corrected. "There's a difference. A lot of people in our situation don't survive. They get crushed by the system and lose everything. We got lucky." He was right, and it was sobering. For every Henderson story with a happy ending, there were probably dozens where elderly homeowners or people facing hardship got foreclosed on, lost their homes, and disappeared without anyone noticing or caring. As the year drew to a close, I reflected on everything that had happened. A simple paint color dispute had exposed corruption, sparked legal reform, and transformed a community. It had also reminded me why fighting for what's right matters, even when it's difficult and scary. The new year arrived with fireworks and celebration. At midnight, standing in my driveway with Frank and Dorothy and a crowd of neighbors, I watched the sky light up with color and felt genuinely hopeful about the future. January brought new HOA board elections, with several of the reform-minded members running for re-election unopposed. The community had learned its lesson about the importance of engaged, ethical leadership. Meeting attendance was up, more homeowners were volunteering for committees, and there was actual debate and discussion about community issues. One of the first actions of the newly confirmed board was to establish an annual award in honor of Frank and Dorothy Henderson, recognizing community members who exemplified integrity, courage, and service to neighbors. The first recipients were Maria Chen for her fundraising and support efforts and Thomas Bradley for his legal work. I don't think we need an award named after us, Dorothy protested when Marcus told her about it, but she was outvoted. The plaque mounted in the community center lobby read, "The Henderson Award for Community Courage," because standing up for what's right is never easy, but always necessary. By February, the changes in Oakmont Hills had become permanent and ingrained. The Architectural Review Committee I served on had processed dozens of requests using the new reasonable guidelines. We'd approved most of them, denied a few that actually would have created safety issues or legitimate aesthetic problems, and worked with homeowners to find compromises on others. The community felt alive in a way it hadn't before. People knew their neighbors' names. They looked out for each other. When one homeowner fell and broke his hip, neighbors organized meal trains and yard care without being asked. That's what community was supposed to be. Frank's 79th birthday in March was celebrated with a neighborhood block party. Over 100 people attended, and the mayor of Scottsdale even stopped by to present Frank and Dorothy with a proclamation honoring their courage and the positive changes they had inspired. "We're just two old people who didn't want to lose our house," Frank said in his brief speech, his voice shaking with emotion. "But we learned that sometimes standing up for yourself means standing up for everyone. Thank you to this community for standing with us." The applause was thunderous. Dorothy wiped tears from her eyes, smiling broadly. I stood next to Thomas, who'd driven down from Phoenix for the celebration, and we exchanged satisfied looks. "You started this," Thomas said to me. "You took those pictures and refused to look away." "I just documented what was happening," I replied. "You're the one who fought the legal battle." "And the Hendersons are the ones who had the courage to fight back instead of giving up," Thomas countered. "It took all of us. That's how justice works." He was right. Justice wasn't something handed down from on high. It was built through the combined efforts of people who cared enough to fight for it. As spring bloomed across Arizona, bringing wildflowers and mild temperatures, I found myself thinking about how different everything was from a year earlier. The Henderson house still bore its terracotta paint, now officially celebrated rather than condemned. Patricia Whitmore was gone, her scheme exposed and her power broken. The community had learned valuable lessons about governance, accountability, and the importance of standing together against abuse. But more than that, I'd learned something about myself. For years after my divorce, I'd kept people at arm's length, staying on the surface of community involvement. The Henderson crisis had forced me out of that comfortable isolation and reminded me that connection and involvement came with risks, but also with profound rewards. I'd made real friends. I'd made a difference in people's lives. I'd been part of something larger than myself, something that mattered. On a particularly beautiful April evening, I sat on my front porch with a book, enjoying the weather. Frank walked by, returning from his woodworking class, and waved. Dorothy was working in her garden, the flowers she'd planted blooming in vibrant colors. Maria drove past, honking and waving. A young couple who'd recently moved in walked their dog, stopping to chat about their plans to join the community center's volleyball league. This was community. This was home. Not perfect, never perfect, but real and alive and fundamentally good. The Henderson case was officially closed now, all appeals exhausted and all settlements paid. Patricia's criminal probation would continue for another 2 years, but she was no longer our concern. The HOA had stabilized under new leadership, The reforms were working, and Oakmont Hills was thriving. But the impact extended far beyond our neighborhood. Thomas told me his firm had won 3 other major HOA cases using the Henderson precedent, protecting homeowners from similar schemes. Dorothy's support group had helped dozens of families fight back against HOA overreach. The legislative reforms had given homeowners across Arizona new tools and protections. One couple's refusal to be bullied had changed an entire system, rippling outward in ways we were still discovering. As summer approached again, bringing with it the anniversary of when Patricia had first served the Hendersons with their violation notice, I suggested we have a celebration, not to commemorate the conflict, but to celebrate how far we'd come. The event was held on the exact date, 1 year later. The community park was packed with residents, all gathering to acknowledge the transformation that had occurred. Marcus gave a speech about the importance of ethical leadership. Dorothy shared her gratitude for everyone who'd supported them. Frank, ever modest, mostly just smiled and shook hands with the endless stream of people thanking him. When it was my turn to speak as the person who'd first helped document the selective enforcement, I kept it brief. "A year ago, this community faced a choice," I said. "We could look away from injustice because it was uncomfortable and risky to get involved, or we could stand up for our neighbors and for what was right. Enough people chose to stand up, and that made all the difference. That's the lesson here. We have power when we choose to use it. We can create change when we're willing to try." The applause was warm and genuine. After the speeches ended, people mingled and ate and enjoyed being together. I found myself in conversation after conversation with neighbors sharing their own stories of how the changes had affected them, how they felt safer and more connected to the community. As the sun set, painting the sky in those brilliant Arizona colors, I stood with Frank and Dorothy watching the crowd. Thank you, Greg," Frank said quietly, "for everything, for seeing what was wrong and caring enough to help." "Thank you for fighting," I replied, "for not giving up when it would have been easier to walk away." Dorothy squeezed both our hands. "We helped each other. That's what neighbors do." She was right, as she so often was. In the end, that was the real story. Not about HOA corruption or legal battles or even justice served, though all of that mattered. The real story was about community, about ordinary people choosing to help each other through difficult times, about the power of connection and courage. The Hendersons' terracotta house stood proud in the evening light, a symbol of resistance and resilience. It would stand for many years to come, a reminder that sometimes the right color isn't the one someone else chooses for you, but the one that reflects who you are and what you're willing to fight for. And in Oakmont Hills, we'd learned that lesson well. We'd learned it through pain and conflict, through legal battles and community transformation. But we'd learned it. The neighborhood would never be the same as it was before, and that was a good thing. We'd been broken and rebuilt, and in the rebuilding, we'd become something better, something stronger, something real. As the celebration wound down and people headed home, I walked with the Hendersons to their door. Their house, that beautiful terracotta house that had caused so much trouble and ultimately so much change, glowed warmly in the porch light. "Home," Dorothy said softly, looking at it with deep satisfaction. "Still home." "Always home," Frank agreed, his arm around her shoulders. I left them there, standing together in the doorway of the home they'd fought so hard to keep, and walked back to my own house, feeling grateful for neighbors like them, for a community that had found its way back to decency, and for the reminder that justice, when pursued with courage and integrity, can actually prevail. The lights in the Henderson house stayed on late that night, as they often did. Inside, I imagined Frank and Dorothy reviewing the photographs from the day's celebration, talking about how far they'd come and how much had changed. Their grandchildren's artwork still covered the refrigerator, their furniture still bore the comfortable wear of 3 decades of living, and their walls still displayed the memories of a life well lived. They'd almost lost it all. But they'd survived, they'd fought back, and they'd won. More than that, they'd helped ensure that other families wouldn't have to face the same abuse. As I settled into bed that night, I thought about the journey from that July day when Patricia had served them with violation notice to this moment, a year later, with justice served, reforms enacted, and a community transformed. It had been exhausting, frustrating, frightening at times, but ultimately worth every moment. Because in the end, the Henderson case wasn't just about one elderly couple or one corrupt HOA president or even one neighborhood in Scottsdale, Arizona. It was about the fundamental principle that people deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, that power should be exercised responsibly, and that communities thrive when they're built on compassion rather than fear. Those principles had been tested in Oakmont Hills, tested severely, and they'd ultimately prevailed. That victory belonged to everyone who'd stood up, everyone who'd refused to look away, everyone who'd chosen courage over comfort. The story could have ended very differently. Without Thomas's legal expertise, without the community's support, without the judge's willingness to see through Patricia's schemes, the Hendersons could have lost everything. That alternate ending haunted me sometimes, a reminder of how fragile justice can be and how much it depends on people choosing to care. But that wasn't the ending we got. We got the one where right prevailed, where corruption was exposed and punished, where an elderly couple got to keep their home and their dignity. We got the ending where a community learned and grew and became better. And as I drifted off to sleep, I felt profoundly grateful to have been part of that story, to have witnessed that transformation, and to have learned those lessons about courage, community, and the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change. The terracotta house still stands in Oakmont Hills, a testament to perseverance and justice. Frank and Dorothy still live there, still wave to neighbors each morning, still tend their garden and welcome grandchildren for visits. The neighborhood still thrives, guided by the lessons learned through their ordeal. And every time I see that beautiful terracotta color glowing in the Arizona sun, I'm reminded that sometimes the fight for what's right begins with something as simple as a paint color, but it ends with something as profound as justice itself.